Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to HRPP's Research Matters. I am Erica Salzik, the Department Administrator for UT Southwestern's Human Research Protection Program, and I'll be one of the moderators for today's session. I'm going to go over some housekeeping items really quickly. So first, if you have any questions for our presenters, please type them in the Q&A. One of the moderators will respond to you during the session, or we will address it at the end of the presentation. This session is recorded and will be available immediately after the conclusion of the live session by clicking on the Microsoft Teams Live link in the email that has been sent out within 24 hours of this session. We will also send the slides and handouts out via the listserv, and you'll also be able to access upcoming Research Matters meeting links, slides, handouts, and previous recordings on HRPP's Research Matters website, which can be found under the Training and Resources page. We do provide a certificate of attendance for those who have logged in using a valid email address. If you do not receive one via email but should have, please send an email to hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu to request a certificate. And lastly, we want to hear from you. We are interested to know what topics you would like us to cover during these sessions. How did our speakers do, and how is our office doing? So if you can take a few minutes to complete the survey and provide your feedback, that would be great. You may access the survey using your phone via the QR code provided here, or I will be dropping a link for the survey in the Q&A in just a moment. Here is the agenda for today. So we have a couple of office updates. I will provide a quick update for HRPP's administrative office. Kim Mapes will provide an update for the Quality Assurance and Monitoring Office, and Mayed Bird will provide an update for the IRB office. Then we'll have a robust presentation on DUA and MTAs, which will be presented by Mayed Bird and Kimberly Hawkins. And if time allows, we'll conclude with an open Q&A session. So, the administrative office proudly announces the promotion of Kim Mapes to the Director of Regulatory Support and Monitoring. Kim will oversee our Quality Assurance and Monitoring Office and our Regulatory Support Office. Kim has an exceptional leadership style and has made outstanding contributions to our organization. Her wealth of experience and dedication will certainly drive our regulatory support and monitoring functions to new heights, ensuring continued success and growth in the HRPP. So congratulations, Kim. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Erica. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kim, and I am very excited to also announce a promotion that is of Manali Thacker to the role of Quality Assurance and Monitoring Program Manager. Manali has 12 years of experience in clinical research. She served as a regulatory monitoring analyst on the QAM team for 2.5 years, and she will now be overseeing the QAM team. We are all very excited to see Manali succeed in her new position. And also, I would like to announce that we do currently have a position posted for a regulatory monitoring analyst. So I encourage anyone that may be interested to go on to the UT Southwestern careers page and apply. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to take over. By the way, congratulations to you and to Manali. Some exciting things for the QAM and the Research Regulatory Support Office. So just a quick announcement from the IRB. So we've had a few staff changes, and that leads us to a few vacancies that we have on the IRB side. And so on our expedited review team, we've got 1 senior regulatory analyst position that is vacant and 3 regulatory analyst positions. And then on our full board team, we've got 1 regulatory analyst position that's available. So if you know anyone that's interested, please share this information. So now I'm going to jump over into my presentation. All right, so it looks like that's live. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you all about navigating or charting the path to scientific collaboration, navigating research data, and biospecimen sharing and agreement requirements. So today I hope to cover the following topics. I always like to start off with, definitions. So what is data and biospecimen sharing? What are some of the regulatory requirements? I like to also cover protocol considerations, consent form considerations, and then finally we'll go over data use and material transfer agreements. So first up, what is data and biospecimen sharing? So I first like to say that this is a practice of making research data and biospecimens available to others for purposes beyond their original study. So what we'd like to do in this situation is when we share the data and biospecimen, it involves providing access to the raw data, to biospecimen, documentation, and other associated materials collected during a research project that enable others to kind of replicate, verify, reproduce, or build upon the findings, maybe of the original study. This is really helpful to science because obviously this can advance science that leads to new discoveries. It can help with reducing kind of the need for having separate IRB approved studies to be implemented. And obviously it provides educational opportunities and as a resource to train and educate new researchers. So let's talk a little bit about the regulations associated with data sharing. And the first and at the top of the list is HIPAA, the HIPAA privacy rule. So with regard to HIPAA and data sharing, there really are no restrictions on the use or disclosure of de-identified health information. When we start talking about a little bit about the covered entities, covered entity may not use or disclose protected health information except where the privacy rule permits or requires, or if the individual to which the information belongs to authorizes the sharing or use or disclosure of their information in writing. A covered entity is also permitted but not required to use the disclosed protected health information without an individual's authorization in the following situations. So obviously when to the individual themselves, anytime that we're offering treatment, payment, healthcare operations. So this is obviously to cover, the cost of care when you're receiving payment, submitting payment to like insurance companies, and then healthcare operations. And these kind of involve those quality improvement activities, to continue to improve the healthcare. There's going to be situations where the individual has an opportunity to agree or object. There's an incident to otherwise permitted use or disclosure. If there's maybe a public interest, we've recently seen this with COVID, so that would be a situation where authorization would not be required, or if there's a limited data set for the use of research, public health, or healthcare operations. Covered entities may rely on professional ethics and best judgments in deciding which of these permissive uses and disclosures to make. Another set of regulations that we kind of have to take into consideration is one of the regulations that we use and we apply to human subject research regardless of federal funding, and this is our famous 45 CFR 46. So one of those components are or actually when we are approving a study, there's regulatory criteria for IRB approval that must be considered. And one of those components is that when appropriate, that there's adequate provisions to protect the privacy of subjects and to maintain the confidentiality of the data. And that's the citation of that particular regulation. Additionally, if a study is regulated by the FDA, we have to take into consideration 21 CFR 50 and 56, where 21 CFR 50 describes it describes consent form requirements, indicating that there should be a statement or must be a statement describing the extent, if any, to which confidentiality of records identifying the subject will be maintained, and that the notes that it notes that there's a possibility for the FDA to inspect those records. Additionally, with the FDA regulations, this is 21 CFR Part 56. This is pretty much similar to 45 CFR 46, where it indicates that there are provisions in place to protect the privacy of subjects and to maintain confidentiality of data. So as an IRB, we are taking into consideration the HIPAA regulations, as well as OHARP, or we would like to say Department of Health and Human Services, and then we also take into consideration the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. We have to take all of those into consideration when we're making decisions about studies, when there's plans to share data or biospecimens. Another component that we have to kind of take into consideration is this new NIH data sharing policy. So I won't cover all of the information about the NIH data sharing policy, as that was covered in a prior Research Matters session that was actually presented by Rhonda Oilepo in January of this year. So the purpose of me talking about this today is really just to kind of, again, talk about how this ties into data sharing. So with regard to the NIH data sharing policy requirements, they require that there be a data management sharing plan. And this is required for all new or competing renewal grants that they receive on or after January 25th of 2023. So that's of this year. Data must be shared at the time of publication or at the end of the award, whichever comes first. And that this applies to all federally funded research conducted in whole or in part by NIH that results in generation of scientific data. And then when I wanted just to kind of highlight what scientific data is. So the NIH defines scientific data to be the recorded factual material commonly accepted in scientific community as sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. They go on to further define scientific data to not include laboratory notebooks, preliminary analyses, completed case report forms, drafts of scientific papers, plans for future research, peer reviews, communication with colleagues, or other physical objects such as laboratory specimens. So again, I want to just provide that definition to the scientific data regarding NIH data sharing policy. So next we would have some protocol considerations that I'd like kind of to talk through. I'm just going to get these all on the screen here. Okay, so with regard to protocol considerations, these are things that the IRB are going to be taking into consideration when we're reviewing your protocol, maybe at the first time or at the time of a modification. So what we're going to be looking at as an IRB, we're going to look at what information is being shared, or what information or biospecimens are being shared. We want to talk about, or your protocol want to address why the information is being shared. We want to talk about who the information will be shared with. And then we have to ask the question about whether the sharing of this information or the materials, whether that recipient site or that recipient collaborator is engaged in research. We want to talk about data specimen security, and then risk and mitigation strategies for data sharing, data biospecimen sharing, I should say, materials, and then retention and disposal of those materials. Oh, and then returning research results to subjects. And then there's the NIH data sharing requirements that we already talked about, but we'll include those in protocol considerations. Okay, so first off, what is being shared? I'm just going to put all of these up on the page here. So I take a moment to talk about de-identified data, specimens, coded, limited data sets, identifiable data or biospecimens. I think it's important to understand that there is a difference between these different categories. When we talk about de-identified data, we're talking about data or biospecimen that has been completely stripped of any type of private identifiable information, or PII, and or protected health information, also known as PHI. So again, that's information or specimens that are completely stripped of any type of mechanism to re-identify who that particular data or specimen, biospecimen, belongs to. coded data or biospecimen is a situation where the information or the specimen has been stripped of all of the private identifiers, protected health information, and has a code attached to this, to the specimen or to the data. Now, if we're talking about sharing, if a recipient of coded data is also receiving a link to the code, then we have to treat that coded data as if it's identifiable. But as long as they're not receiving the link to re-identify who that data or that biospecimen belongs to, it's almost like that coded data is de-identified to the recipient investigator. And then we have the limited data set. The limited data set, it really just refers to data itself. It's not referencing biospecimens, but a limited data set has been completely stripped of all private identifiable information and most of the protected health information, but it does contain elements of date and zip codes. And then finally, we have identifiable data or biospecimens, and obviously this contains private identifiable information and or protected health information. So I think that that's really important to kind of delineate, but it's important in your protocol to include what information is being shared with your collaborators, with external entities, because this can take you down different paths in terms of what is needed in your informed consent document, in your protocol, and maybe even in data use agreements. Next up, we want to know why the materials are being shared. So what is the purpose of the data sharing? The IRB is looking to make sure that your data sharing aligns with kind of what's happening in the protocol and whether it's in the best interest of the research participant, whether that information or that specimen or the materials be shared. And also the IRB is looking at that information to ensure that the sharing really is going to advance scientific knowledge. So next, we want to talk about with whom the data is going to be shared. So we want to make sure that we include information about like names and entities in which the data is or the specimens are going to be shared. This helps the IRB determine if the sharing has been properly disclosed in the informed consent document and your HIPAA authorization. If there's going to be a disclosure plan, say for example, you've got a study, maybe it's a chart review study and there's a waiver, a HIPAA waiver in place. There's a section of that form where we talk about disclosure. So we want to make sure that we list the disclosure correctly in that HIPAA waiver request form. And then also we want to make sure that we take an opportunity that if that information is being shared with entities outside of the United States, that we do a check to ensure that there are no embargoes in place with that external entity. So this is why it's really important that your protocol outline with whom the data is to be shared or with whom the specimen is to be shared. So then this kind of begs the next question. So if we go down the path of sharing information, sharing specimens, sharing data, and there is information that is attached to that is maybe identifiable or there's private identifiable information, there's more elements of protected health information that is shared along with the data and or the biospecimens. We have to make a decision about, is that recipient, investigator, or entity engaged in research? And one of the famous response that you'll probably receive from our office is this: it depends, right? And this goes back to kind of what I was originally talking about is, what information is being shared, right? So one of the things that we have to take into consideration is whether identifiable information is being shared. So if the recipient of this information, that's a collaborator or an entity, will receive identifiable data or biospecimens, this may possibly indicate that this entity is engaged in research. And so if we go down, I always talk about paths, right? Based on information we receive, sometimes we go down different paths. So if we go down this path, then we have to entertain the idea that, if this is a federally funded project and we're sharing information and it's identifiable and there's another site receiving identifiable information, do we now have to insert single IRB review, right? So if the recipient entity will receive identifiable information, how will IRB approval be handled? So this is where I bring up the SIRB question. So is this a situation where we now need to consider being the IRB of record for multiple study sites now that this site may possibly receive identifiable information? Obviously, under a situation where a study is not federally funded, we've got a little bit more flexibility to use, other IRBs and not have a single IRB review situation. But again, if this is federally funded, there's a mandate for single IRB review. So, that's why I say it's really important to talk about these details in your protocol, because it helps us as an IRB walk down the paths of whether additional approvals are needed. Okay, so then next we will talk about data security. How will data security be handled? So what the IRB wants to see kind of in your protocol, or what are the safeguards that are going to be in place while you're sharing the data that will prevent unauthorized access, breaches, or misuse of the information or the specimens. So this is information, as I mentioned, should be in your protocol. We want to make sure that you include the methods of transmitting data or biospecimens to the external entity or the collaborator. I know one of the more popular, methods to transmit information is data, I should say, because obviously you can't transmit specimens through REDCap, but REDCap is a nice tool to have in place on studies, because when you devise or when you develop your REDCap project where you're collecting data, the REDCap has a really neat functionality to indicate whether a field or a variable is an identifier, so that way it can be flagged appropriately. So when you download the data and you want to share the information, those fields that have been identified as identifiable, they can, be excluded in the data sharing. Obviously, you want to make sure you check the data before you share it, but REDCap is a very popular platform that's used for studies, but also for data sharing. So next we have to talk about in our protocol, or what are some risk mitigation strategies. And so I have some risk, and then I have some possible mitigation strategies that you should kind of outline and detail in your protocol. So for the risk of privacy, so if there's a risk of disclosure of sensitive information that can lead to breaches of confidentiality or privacy, then one way to mitigate that would be to share the information in a de-identified manner, or coded, right, where the recipient investigator doesn't have access to the link to re-identify who that information or the specimen belongs to. So that would be one way of mitigating that particular risk, and you'll of course want to outline this out in your protocol. The risk of data misuse, future research implications, material used for unintended, unapproved purposes or by unauthorized parties. So obviously the one way of mitigating that is to ensure the informed consent and authorization are clear about who the materials will be shared with and what they will be used for, and whether there might be any type of data use agreements that are, I should say, actually, it's informed consent and HIPAA authorization, talk about it, or that there's a data use agreement in place for that. If there's a risk of stigmatization or criminalization to research participants, then making sure that you only share the minimum necessary and that there's additional safeguards in place. So that would be one way of mitigating the risk, is ensuring that your protocol talks about that you're only sharing the information that is necessary in order for your collaborator to carry out, the additional components of whatever they're doing, maybe part of your study, or maybe it's a secondary use. And then, there might be a risk of cultural ethical considerations. So some communities may have concerns about the use of their materials in research. So this is something that, you might want to reach out to your IRB and help with ensuring that you've got a mitigation strategy in place, and include those details in your protocol itself. So the next item is that you should include in your protocol is how long materials will be retained or disposed. So the protocol would need to include information about how long you're going to be making materials available for data sharing, or specimen sharing, and establish procedures for disposition if there is one. So obviously, if there is a situation where you don't plan to dispose of materials, you should be assessing whether those materials should become part of maybe a registry or a repository of information. So obviously the repository will have other procedures, administration procedures around that. But again, you should just be assessing whether the materials will become part of a research repository. And then finally, in your research protocol, you should be talking about, how and returning research results to participants. So for federally funded researchers must have a plan for how and when the results will be returned to research participants. And as an IRB, we always like for you all to take into consideration, whether the information would be meaningful to the individual, to the healthcare provider, would be meaningful to the healthcare provider or to the individual. Whether the information would have any type of significant impact on the health management decisions, and whether the impact would be critical and or time sensitive. And then with regard to NIH data sharing, the IRB must review the data management sharing plan to ensure that the protocol and consent form are consistent with that plan. The IRB must also review the risk associated with the data sharing. With the sharing of the data of the participants or the groups. And the IRB must review the consent form again to ensure that data sharing is consistent with the protocol, data sharing plan, and that the risk have been appropriately described. So now moving over to the informed consent HIPAA authorization. So our template, our informed consent template, does actually have a lot of the information kind of built into it. So the informed consent document needs to include a statement that sharing is going to happen and, the purpose of that. Your consent form will also need to describe how confidentiality will be maintained, and whether there's risk and benefits associated with sharing of their information or their specimens, any type of security measures, and then obviously returning clinically relevant results to research participants. Like I say, if you use our informed consent template, a lot of this information actually has been drafted for you. It's template language, and you can select the appropriate language that needs to be put into the informed consent document. This next section I thought was really interesting is returning research results to participants, because I don't think that we see this enough. So in a situation where there's planned data sharing, and if there's subsequent testing that's done with specimens or with data, then there's this idea of returning research results to participants. So as I mentioned before, kind of in your protocol, this is what you outline, but this also needs to be outlined in the informed consent document. So the way I kind of look at this is, you could have a result that could happen based on secondary testing. So in a situation where the outcome or the result would be that the information is critical to the management of the participant's health in the immediate or near future, you would want to make sure that you have a plan to immediately return that information to participants and to their care provider if the participant agrees, so that the participant can obtain appropriate health care. Something that you can include in the informed consent document is any information that might be immediately critical to your health will be shared with you or your healthcare provider. One result could be that there's a known implication about health or a risk, but they're not. They are clinically actionable, but not urgent. So they're not time sensitive. So as a researcher, you should have plans to return this information if it's feasible and if the participant agrees. So things that you should take into consideration with regard to returning the information to the research participants is obviously the resources necessary to return the results and how you can facilitate next steps for the participants' health care. Some information that you can include in the consent form would be, we will share information that may be helpful for you for your health in the future, and you can fill in the blank, this is labs, images. They may show that you have an increased risk of whatever the condition is. You can describe why it's important to share this information, and obviously the option to have this the research participant receive that information, have it documented. In situation where there's a known implication about health risk, but they're not clearly actionable, it's going to be pretty much the same in terms of the plan. You return the results to the participants if they agree, but some of the considerations could be, risk of the knowledge, the actions that can be taken, your resources to be able to return this information to the participant, and then steps for healthcare, the next steps for healthcare. You can pretty much say something similar, we're going to learn things about you, and you might find them interesting, but may not be helpful to you. Your healthcare providers may not be able to help with this situation or know what it even means. Describe why it's helpful to the individual, and obviously I have a way for the individual to document that they want to receive this information. And then obviously the last result is that you might find out something that that has no known implication for health or risk. Same considerations where, in terms of planning to give the information back to the research participant. You can also plan to not provide this information because it's not meaningful. So it's pretty much the same as before. And then the final thing that I wanted to kind of talk about is with regard to the NIH's data sharing plan. So this is actually taken from Rhonda's presentation from January. I thought it was really helpful because she did a really good job of creating these boxes of information. So whenever you're sharing data and with repositories, and it's where you have obtained informed consent for sharing, the consent form should state that this information is going to be shared in an open access repository. And then obviously when you're sharing the information in that access repository, the identifier should be removed, but the consent form must specify the type and identifiability of the data that's to be shared. And the consent must specify that the data sharing will be in an open access, which allows anyone to access and use the data set. And then in situations where the data is going to be shared in a controlled access, then the consent form must explicitly specify the type and identifiability of the data to be shared. And then you may need to have you may need to specify required controls within that controlled access. In situations where consent for data sharing was not obtained, either because it was prior to the required date or you didn't obtain the informed consent, then you can only share de-identified or limited data sets. It can only be shared with a controlled access repository, and then you may need to have more specific requirements for controls. In situations where consent was waived by the IRB, the data must be de-identified and only share control access information with the repository. So I thought that information was helpful in terms of what is needed for the informed consent document. I think that is all that I have. I'm going to turn things over to Kimberly, who's going to talk about data use agreements and material transfer agreements and a little bit about the process and kind of what we're looking at from an IRB standpoint.
Thank you, Mayed. So next we're going to discuss the data use agreements and material transfer agreements. So unlike the fellow in this cartoon, we're going to attempt to take the mystery out of data use and material transfer agreements. A data use agreement is a legally binding agreement that outlines the terms and conditions of data sharing. It includes restrictions on data sharing and confidentiality. So important elements in the agreement include the parties in the agreement, obviously the institutions and the investigators. One interesting thing is that it may include a third party. For example, Parkland, if Parkland originally provided the data, they must be named in the data use agreement and they will sign the agreement. So when you list the source of the original data, you will list Parkland, as well as Children's or wherever you got the data. The data type that will be shared, you'll list a limited data set or de-identified data. The effective date and how many years the agreement will be in place will be in the agreement. So when is a DUA needed? Well, when you're sharing de-identified data, the type of agreement is a data transfer agreement. Although in e-agreements, you are going to select a data use agreement, if your entity or organization is a not-for-profit organization and it's located in the United States, UT Southwestern does not require a data transfer agreement to provide de-identified data to a not-for-profit institution located in the United States. But one will provide one if the other organization requires an agreement. So that means that you don't have to submit a data transfer agreement in e-agreements or a data use agreement in e-agreements if you are providing de-identified data to a not-for-profit in the United States. However, if the other organization is requiring that, you would go ahead and submit it, and we will do that. But you do need to review your protocol and your consent form, your HIPAA authorization waiver, to see if you're prohibited from sharing. If you've said in your consent form or protocol that you're not going to share with anybody external to the institution, then you need to do a modification in order to share. So for for-profit entities, these agreements will be reassigned to the Office of Technology Development, and they will process these rather than the HRPP. And for international entities, like Mayed said, we will do an export control check. And so what happens there is that Mayed will confirm with visual compliance that there are no restrictions or embargoes on that country. If there are embargoes, then we'll notify the research team and we will withdraw the agreement. And then if the BI has questions about why it can't be processed, then the export control office may be contacted to discuss that. So what if you want to share a limited data set, which Mayed described includes dates or zip codes? For that, the agreement type is a data use agreement, and for not-for-profit entities in the U.S., it is a data use agreement is required, and will be processed by the HRPP department. For-profit entities will be reassigned to the Office of Technology Development, or OTD. And international entities, again, will have an export control check and will be processed by HRPP department. So what is a material transfer agreement? So it's a contract that governs the transfer of tangible research materials between two organizations when the recipient intends to use the materials for his or her own research purposes. Tangible research materials include biological specimens, devices, prototypes, circuits, chemical compounds, genetically engineered organisms, cell lines, etc. These are also submitted in the agreements and are processed by OTD. But on each one involving human research, the HRPP department receives a request to provide an ancillary review. So I want to reiterate that e-agreements is a system that is owned by OTD. So the HRPP is notified whenever there's an agreement where human subjects research is involved. This is important so that you understand where there's a handoff from OTD to HRPP and where there may be delays. I also want you to understand that in e-agreements, these are listed as multiple transfer agreements, or MMTAs. So for IRB considerations, the HRPP reviews the EIRB study for these agreements, whether it's an ancillary review or whether we're looking at the data use agreement, or MTA. The IRB office compares the request in the DUA and MTA to see if it's consistent with the sharing plan in the protocol, consent, and HIPAA documents. If the participants were told that their specimens and/or data would not be shared with external entities, we also look at the reconsenting plan. A modification is required to list each agreement in Section 24 and to revise the study documents to allow for data sharing. So please note that item 24 asks, will data or specimens be shipped or sent to other facilities? However, this section is intended for data or specimens that are both being sent and received. We'd like to update our system, but there's a code freeze right now because the RAS team is using their resources to create the new EIRB system. So, so for right now, you just need to understand that it means both sent and received. So how are DUAs and MTAs submitted? When the slides are sent to you, you will be provided with a copy of these with the data use agreement submission guide, from which I took these screenshots. So you can use that guide. Hopefully it will be helpful when you create these agreements. But when you log into e-agreements, there's a button to create agreements. You'll be given a list of agreement types, and data use agreements and multiple material transfer agreements will be on that list. So in the next slides, I'll go over the most common requests for changes that I see when I'm processing these. So on the first tab, the agreement upload tab, the first item that I see is item number 6, supporting documents. Please upload a list of data points. And because this needs to go into the agreement, we need to know what data points are you sending to the other site. Because we need to be able to say definitively whether you're sending a de-identified data set or a limited data set. And we can't tell that if we don't know what data points you're sending. So if it's a limited data set, be sure to include the dates or the 5-digit zip code. And in 7.0, the question to answer in this section is, if you're given an agreement by the organization, can we use the UT Southwestern agreement template instead? The reason is that OTD has approved the language in these templates, and if they have to approve the language in the template sent by the other organization, there may be a delay. So the general information tab, in 1.1, the contracting party should be the legal or contracts office at the organization. Note, don't list the PI at the contracting party, and not having this information may cause a significant delay because it's sometimes hard for those reviewing the agreement to figure this out. So this is an important piece of information that we need. If you need to amend a prior agreement in 5.0, then you could put yes in 5.0, and that means that we'll be doing an amendment rather than a new agreement. So in the direction of transfer tab, you'll be putting receiving if you're receiving the data, or providing, but it can be both. So if you're receiving the data, OTD is going to be processing it. And I put a link in there because this pulls up a list about, they've divided their staff up by departments, and you can look up to see who's going to be processing your agreement by your department. If it's providing or receiving and providing, the HRPP department will be processing those. So on the data use information tab, we have several pieces of information here. In item number 1.0, the name of the PI at the contracting party, please provide their credentials because that needs to go in the agreement. In 2.0, the data type, it's either going to be just select one. Now I understand that it says check all that apply, but we are going to be working with OTD to update this section, and it should just say select one. So select de-identified or limited data set, and note, do not use protected health information. And the reason is that if if you're providing protected health information, it should already be provided in the consent HIPAA authorization form or the HIPAA waiver form. And that's, it should already support the disclosure, or you need to do a modification in order to get IRB approval to support the disclosure. And I've provided the link to the DUA DTA decision tree. So you can look at that. In 3.0, describe the data. If you uploaded the document in the agreements uploads tab that we already talked about, you can just type refer to the list of data points uploaded in the agreements upload section 6.0 supporting documents. So that's what it's asking, is describe the data, and you've already done that. You've listed the data points in that document. In 4.0, IRB protocol number, this is required so that the IRB can review the protocol consent in SMART form. So in continuation of this document, 5.0. So explain how the PI at the other organization will use the data. If they have a study number, title, and purpose, please include that in this section, because that goes into the agreement. In 6.0, how long will the data be used? Right now, this is not a required question, but it should be, because when I go to create the agreement, if I don't have the number of years that the data will be used, then I can't determine the expiration date of the agreement, so that I have to send it back and ask for it, or I have to contact you. So list the source of the data that you're providing. This is important, especially in the case of Parkland, as we've already discussed, because they have to be named in the agreement and sign it. And then if there's any additional information that you need to provide, please list it in this section. And the next step is to submit the agreement. So e-agreements is not under a code freeze. So like I said, we're going to be working with OTD to update the questions so that you'll be prompted to give us the information more easily the first time. So this is the workflow for e-agreements. And so the first step is pre-submission. That's when the agreement is in draft state, when you're creating it. Step 2 is the agreement is in the HRPP or OTD's inbox for assignment. Step 2A is it's possible that clarifications may be requested at this stage, but normally an owner is assigned first. Step 3, once an owner is assigned, a review is conducted. Step 3A, if clarifications are required, the agreement is sent back to the PI and the person who submitted the agreement in the application. Step 4, once all clarifications have been addressed, the agreement is drafted and it's emailed to the contracting party, to the PI at the organization, the UT Southwestern PI, the person who submitted the request, and any other contacts listed in the agreement application. Step 4A, if the contracting party requests edits to the agreement, the HRPP requests review of the language from OTD. So the agreement may go back and forth a couple of times due to contract language negotiations prior to being partially executed by the organization listed in the agreement. Step 5, the partially executed agreement is forwarded for UT Southwestern signatures. And step 6, once the agreement is signed, it's uploaded in e-agreements and becomes active. So thank you. That's our presentation. We'd love to hear your feedback.
Okay, everyone. Yes, this does conclude the presentations, and we have some time still left, so we're going to move into our open Q&A session. I invite you to submit any questions or comments that you have at this time. And I'm just going to pause for a few seconds to allow you some time to type up those questions. Okay, so while we wait for you to get them typed up, if you did have a question, I just want to remind you of the survey. If you can just spend a few minutes to complete the questions, we will use the information to improve the content of these sessions and how we present them. We will also be able to see what areas we need to work on in the office and what areas we are excelling in. We actually did get a question come through, so maybe Mayed or Kimberly, you can answer it. Do we need to execute a DUA with Parkland each time we get their data?
No, we do not.
Okay. Who is the point person in the HRPP office for DUAs?
That would be Kimberly.
Yes.
I am the
That would
point
be
person.
you. Okay. We do have a question not related to the topics. It is, please advise if we will be getting the recording and the slides, and the answer to that is yes. We will send out an email via the listserv and attach the slides and any handouts. The recording will be available just by selecting the link. You can replay it at the conclusion of this session, and we'll also post the recording and the slides on the Research Matters website. We have another question. Is a DUA required for receiving de-identified data?
No, it is not required for receiving de-identified data. However, we can create a DTA if the sender requires it.
Okay, thank you. Was just waiting to see if any more questions are going to pop up. I'm not seeing any at this moment. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the session. I just want to thank our presenters, Mayed and Kimberly, and thank you all for attending today's session. The next Research Matters session is scheduled for November 21st. Have a great rest of your week, guys.